Well, colleagues, friends, welcome to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. My name is Zach Pakin, and among other things, I'm proud to be a senior fellow here with IPD. For those of you joining us for the first time, IPD is a realism and restraint-oriented think tank operating both in Canada and in the United States. At IPD, we value diversity of opinion, open debate, and fresh ideas in the quest to build a Western foreign policy fit for the realities of a multipolar world. Donald Trump has now won Saturday's GOP primary in his opponent Nikki Haley's home state of South Carolina. Super Tuesday is just around the corner, and polls show Trump holding a massive 70-point lead, 7-0, over his rival in delegate-rich states such as California and Texas. Saturday also marked the 2-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and with Trump set to become his party's presumptive nominee over the coming weeks. Many are wondering what impact a second Trump term in the White House would have on Ukraine and on Europe more broadly, especially given Trump's recent remarks that the Russians should, quote, do whatever the hell they want, end quote, to NATO members who fail to meet the alliance's spending commitments. So here to help us unpack all of this, we've got a veritable all-star panel of experts from the United States and from Europe. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Reed Smith is Vice President of Foreign Policy at the Stand Together Trust. Benjamin Friedman is Policy Director at Defense Priorities, and Max Bergman is Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. And last but certainly not least, joining us from across the pond where I am as well, Natalie Tocci is the Director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. And Natalie, I'd like to start with you, if that's all right, and with the topic of Ukraine. Because just yesterday, French President Emmanuel Macron refused to rule out the possibility that EU and NATO countries might send their own troops to Ukraine, given Kiev's recent setbacks on the battlefield, although other European leaders have been quick to shut this discussion down. Nonetheless, it does raise the question of how much leaders and their publics in Europe might see the stakes in this conflict a little bit differently. Polling conducted recently by ECFR, by the European Council on Foreign Relations across 12 EU member states, shows that publics in Hungary, Greece, Italy, Romania, and Austria, by large margins, want to see pressure applied on Ukraine to negotiate a compromise peace with Russia. And if Donald Trump is elected and he decides to limit U.S. support to Ukraine, 1/3 of respondents across all 12 surveyed countries want to see Europe limit its support and push for a peace deal with Russia as well. Only 20% want to see European support for Ukraine increased to make up for the American shortfall. So I'm wondering, what does this tell you about Europe's ability to continue marshaling support for Ukraine in the event of a Trump victory, and how much will public opinion end up shaping the decisions that leaders take?
Well, thanks, Zach, and great being here. So let me perhaps just start off by saying that, I think that, yes, whereas, of course, there is a public opinion versus government story, it's a very differentiated one, right? In the sense that public opinion in many of the Eastern European and Northern European countries are very aligned with where their governments are. So it is quite clear that the closer you are to the threat, and the more you perceive that threat, and therefore the more likely it is that you will see your own security and more broadly European security passing through Kyiv. So I think there's that important geographic distinction to be made. I think a second point that I should mention is that if I take my own country, right, which is probably amongst the most skeptical countries as far as public opinion is concerned vis-a-vis Ukraine. So I've been very involved in debates in my own country on Ukraine, and it's very clear to me where that skepticism comes from. And frankly speaking, it has very little to do with Ukraine. It has a lot to do with a very diffuse, but really quite deep anti-Americanism in a country like Italy. And I suspect that the same goes, for instance, for a country like Greece, right? It has partly to do with the fact that the Vatican, in particular, has actually provided a if you like, a sort of ethical backing, implicitly so, right, to what Russia has been doing. And I think that has also played an important role. And then it has broadly got to do with the fact that, sort of Ukraine has been perceived as being fairly distant, and then hence the geographic distinction that I was making earlier. Now, if then that turns into the question of, do we or can we imagine that skeptical public opinions in countries that are further away from the front line are going to be sufficient to overturn government policy? Actually, I think they won't. And let me perhaps just spend 30 seconds explaining why. Now, had Russia won in its battle to militarize, as it did, gas vis-a-vis Europe, so had it won that battle, then I would have probably said that that skeptical public opinion would have become electorally very costly. But that battle was not won by Putin, right? In a sense, the energy crisis is, well, not in a sense, it is over. It certainly is over as far as it's related to Russia. And so, through all the talk of Ukraine fatigue in West European countries, it's really not quite clear what this fatigue actually means, right? Because, it's not as if an economic cost is being paid for the war. And so, regardless of what public opinion may be, if you ask in a survey, this is not something that people are voting on. It is not something that is going to make or break, Giorgia Meloni's success now, or if the Democrat Party were in government and it would be doing exactly what Giorgia Meloni is doing now as far as Ukraine is concerned. So I don't actually see that skepticism really being a skepticism that translates in electoral support. And governments know this. And all this, just to sort of finish off that first thought, all this in a context in which things have been going, quote unquote, relatively well, right? So in a sense, for the little that we've done towards Ukraine, in the big scheme of things militarily, Ukraine has actually held up incredibly well. Now, what if things actually were to start going badly? Well, then you could quite, sort of imagine a situation in which, the sense of threat, even in countries further away from Russia, would actually start increasing, which would make that public opinion government divide, even in West European countries, actually diminish further.
Excellent. Thanks so much for helping us unpack that. Ben, let me come to you. I mean, Natalie just spoke about, how we see some differences between Western and Eastern European countries of how they see the war affecting their interests and how they might converge depending on how things go. In that scenario in which things really start to head south for Ukraine, how would a Trump administration, in your view, react? Is Ukraine likely to be still a significant priority for a second Trump administration, in part due to the sunk cost fallacy, the credibility test and the pronouncements that, the Biden administration has made to date? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I should say is I don't know, in that I think the second Trump administration is even more predictable than I mean, politics is generally hard to predict. The second Trump administration is especially hard to predict. I think there is this thesis that actually a lot of people who are both extremely anti-Trump and pro-Trump have, that the second term will be the true Trump. And where in the first term he was surrounded by creatures of Washington and unable for that, and I suppose inexperience to act on his true instincts, to just more or less abandon Europe. In a second term, he would be able to really act on his inclinations in that regard. And I I already said I don't think it's easy to predict, but I'm not really a believer in that. I think that the second Trump administration would be more like the first, and there's strong reasons for that. I mean, I think it's just number one, it's hard to find those people, even if you want them. There are a lot of people working on this who will sort of, be the extremely pro real Trump warriors. Secondly, the inclinations of the man, his habits. I think he's still really prone to hire people who say nice things about him and kiss his butt. And the same John Bolton problem, essentially. I mean, he's not going to hire John Bolton again, but I'm not sure that that kind of thing is extinct, which would obviously be a kind of a push to stay in the status quo lanes. And then thirdly is the politics. And, I don't think that a big Russian breakthrough, at least the sort of likely one, would have a very big effect on U.S. domestic politics. I mean, I think I agree with what Natalie said for the most part. I think, it's the safety that Western Europeans and Americans in particular have from Russia that allows this to be a partisan football. If the threat's really breathing, like the wolf is at the door, so to speak, it tends to create a degree of unity and focus, but that's just not the case. And I don't think the Russians, even if they have more success, are capable of mounting that kind of threat with the United States, at least, would really look up and say, okay, this is a real threat. I mean, we have all the rhetoric from our political leaders saying this is our fight and this is our, democracy on the line. And it's all essentially a mythology that's extremely hard to sell. We're working with and for Ukraine because of ideological sympathy and anti-Russian antipathy. And I don't say this in a pejorative way, but it's essentially a charity project we're doing. And I just think that it's hard to motivate people in the same way you would for a truly big threat when, it's a sort of ideological and moral project as opposed to the, more interest-based one. So anyway, my answer is I don't think it would change much if Russia breaks through. And I think the Trump administration will behave sort of like Trump in his first term, where, if you remember, he didn't, except for the little thing that got him impeached for a couple weeks, he never cut off aid to Ukraine. In fact, he increased aid over what the Obama administration had done and seemed very happy to kind of live in a rhetorical world where he would bash NATO, where he would sort of say that he was extracting all this money for NATO, which wasn't real, at best future promises, at worst just nothing at all. And so, I think the Trump would be more likely to, govern from a kind of, the reality would be status quo, and then there'd be the rhetoric going on, which would be what everyone fears, but that's just the rhetoric. So I hope that's coherent.
For sure, that's very clear. Thank you. And then we'll come back to the question of narratives in a second. But first, let me go over to Reed. And if you could help our audience to get a sense, Reed, of how Donald Trump sees the war in Ukraine in terms of whether it's a priority for him to end it in a second term if he's elected. Would he prioritize striking some kind of deal with Putin over the head of Ukraine, over the head of Europe? If so, at what cost? And would domestic opposition to Trump from Congress, from half the population who may even view his presidency as illegitimate, would all of that really hamper his ability to strike some kind of deal on Ukraine with Putin and almost make him a lame duck president on some of these issues?
Yeah, I think that's a good question and one which remains to be seen. Of course, candidate Trump on the stump talks constantly about his desire to end this war in Ukraine almost overnight, right? He talks about some sort of 24-hour deal. My hunch is that most Democrats and political opponents of Donald Trump in America would cry foul, right? Because any sort of deal that could be negotiated in any sort of short order would undoubtedly, give away the farm, so to speak, as far as those most kind of vocal evangelists for, a return to full Ukrainian sovereign borders. So I think there would be a lot of hostility towards any deal that a President Trump in his second term would attempt to strike. particularly with Vladimir Putin at the other end of the negotiating table. So yeah, I think in some ways, although many have suspected that Putin would be happier negotiating with Trump, I think Trump would, in some ways, be constrained, whether by, as Ben alluded, differences between the principal and his deputies in his own administration, or the domestic politics at play in Washington across the country. Although I will say that for the broad part of his conservative base, right, they're pretty checked out of the war in Ukraine. And I think Americans in general are less fervently committed to the media spectacle that sort of, kind of delighted their fancy back in February and March of 2022. But particularly on the conservative side, I think that the party seems to have moved towards sort of rank order prioritization, and Ukraine falls pretty far down the list, right? They're looking at the border, they're concerned about Israel, they're thinking about China. Ukraine and Russia is no longer, the cause celeb that it was really with bipartisan unanimity a couple years ago. So I think that generally the Republican Party would have Trump's back if he decided he wanted to have a go of negotiating something sooner than later. Obviously, that would excite Democratic antipathies, but I think that's probably something Trump would be willing to live with.
Got it. Thanks so much. Max, let's go back to a point that Ben was raising about Trump's first term in office and how much it might actually come to resemble what he might do in a second term. Because what we learned from his first term is that what Trump says on the one hand and what his administration ends up doing policy-wise are two very different things. And he was often labeled in the media as some kind of Russian stooge or puppet. But if you look at the policy record, his administration drove a hard bargain on the INF treaty, on the New START treaty negotiations as well. It did not shy away from providing Ukraine with lethal military assistance or attacking Russia's ally in Syria, Bashar al-Assad. And we've just seen in a recent New York Times expose just how close, the relationship between the CIA and Ukraine got under his administration as well. So, with all of that in mind, how do you think he's going to approach the Ukraine file if he's elected?
Well, I guess, first, thanks for having me. It's great to be with everybody. I guess I would disagree with Ben. Look, I think it's going to be very different than the first term. I think when I think about Trump's first term, I think of people who were shocked. Trump was shocked that he won, and there was no plan. He didn't have a roster of people that were loyal to him. There was sort of no sort of clear set agenda, particularly on foreign policy. And so he ended up picking a lot of the people that would probably serve in a Mitt Romney administration. When you have General Mattis as your Secretary of Defense, even Rex Tillerson as the CEO of Exxon. I mean, all of these people were sort of very traditional. I mean, H.R. McMaster as the National Security Advisor, and then picking John Bolton, who you could probably credit or blame for the INF Treaty withdrawal, who has long-standing, very neoconservative views when it comes to arms control. And we're very at odds with Trump's efforts, for instance, to try to negotiate peace with North Korea. I think what you saw is a sort of administration that wasn't really coherent. I mean, Trump ordered the troops out of Germany, and then essentially Secretary of Defense Mark Esper did not do it. So I think there was a lot of confusion and also a recognition that Trump had a fleeting attention span. And so if you're sort of told something on Twitter by Trump that this is how the policy should be, you could just try to not do it. I just don't think that's going to be the case this time, in part because what happens when you have 4 years out of power, and this is true with all the people that were serving the Biden administration, used to be in the Obama administration, spent, what do we really want to do here? And the Biden folks came in wanting to sort of pivot to Asia, but you start thinking about what your plan is, who your people are. And I see a lot more planning going into a second Trump administration. And I don't think that's good for Europe, frankly, because a lot of that planning is about how to actually implement Trump's views on NATO, which are crystal clear. He is not a fan of NATO, views it more or less as a protection racket. You can disagree with that, but I think if you disagree with that, you're likely not going to be a position of power. And I do think now there's lots of other people that Trump could identify to run various cabinet agencies. Josh Hawley as Secretary of Defense is a name thrown around. And I think Josh Hawley wouldn't have a problem following through on pulling troops out of Germany. So I think this will be a very different administration. And then how that applies to Ukraine is, I think, Trump may or may not try to negotiate, have a negotiated peace on day one. But negotiating peace settlements is very hard. It's very time consuming. I doubt there's that sort of a level of attention to this. And I think the big question for Ukraine is then whether it will have access to, hopefully at that point, large quantities of European weapons if Europe can ever get its defense industries ramped up, which may be given by the events of yesterday in Paris with Macron. This does not look positive, I would say, that Europeans are still sort of not allocating the funding that's necessary to just ramp up industrial production. But if you're Ukraine, you're hoping to not be as dependent on the United States come January, February of 2025 as you are right now in February of 2024. And so, U.S. Ability to negotiate over your heads, which I think in some ways is very limited, will be quite curtailed. The last thing I would just say is that it really takes two to tango here when you're going to have negotiations. And the fact is, right now, the Russians think they're winning in part because we're not providing Ukraine weapons. So if you really want a negotiated settlement, and this is, I think, Ukraine's best chance of going to Donald Trump and saying, well, if you want to have negotiations, the Russians have to believe that they are not going to win the war. And in order for that to happen, we need to be supplied with weapons. And I think that's, a strong argument Ukraine can make, hopefully right now, as well as for a future, if there is a future Trump administration.
Ben, do you want to come back in on any of that, or?
Well, I mean, I was very coherent. I don't, like I said, I think it's rather unpredictable. What I would say is I think Max is right that Trump will probably do better on personnel that are more Trumpy this time around. But I'm sort of hanging my hat on, number one, the power of the past to predict the future, and secondly, that it's the same guy. And I think that, there's strong reasons to think that his, as I said, Trump will tend to be satiated by, people genuflecting at him and saying, oh, of course, we'll spend more money and, not pull the rug out. But, again, I say it's rather unpredictable. So I could certainly be wrong. And then the other thing I wanted to add was just that on this point about Russian willingness to negotiate, I think it's probably true what Max said, that they're, because they feel that the wind is in their sails, they're not really willing to at least have serious talks, despite their repeated statements that they're willing to talk whenever. But what I would also say is that it's kind of a hypothesis that I think we should test from my perspective, given I think what American interests are in Ukraine, and this idea that the Russians are never going to be reasonable in negotiations is something that one could evaluate, and by talking to them and seeing what their actual position is, and if you take it seriously and actually put, as we should, I think, Ukrainian neutrality, which is to say a promise not to put them in NATO or do something like it, on the table, that might have a pretty large effect on what you can get out of the Russians in talks. So anyway, I think, there's no reason. I think we have nothing to lose in the United States from running the experiment and, getting the ball rolling.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Let's go back to Natalie now, because we're currently seeing populism on the rise, not just in the US, but also in Europe. And European leaders have pledged that Ukraine's future lies unambiguously in Europe as a member of the European Union. But we do have at least a couple of problems. First, it's hard to imagine Ukraine rebuilding, reforming, meeting the requirements for EU membership if it continues to fight a devastating war. And we just heard from some of our recent panelists just how hard it's going to be to get some kind of a negotiated settlement that could clear the ground for having enough space to have people consider investing in the rebuilding of Ukraine. And then second of all, of course, populist leaders, including a possible President Marine Le Pen of France in 2027, may be unwilling to sacrifice the economic interests of their domestic support base in order to bring Ukraine and its large agricultural sector into the European Union. So what does all of this tell us about Europe's ability to support Ukraine, not just militarily, but more generally in the event that the US loses interest in this? And just how meaningful, in your view, are the pledges that European leaders are making to Ukraine today?
So let me be very clear on this. Well, think, and then, perhaps later on, we're also, we may also touch on issues and similarities that have to do with, the threat to democracy in the US and in Europe, which is, of course, where this whole nationalist populism story sort of comes in. But I think as far as Ukraine is concerned, I actually think there's a fundamental difference, and that fundamental difference is geography. So, I concede. I wouldn't say this would necessarily reflect a particularly enlightened understanding of the US national security interest, but I can conceive of a United States led by Donald Trump, or perhaps even not by Donald Trump, turning its back to European security and turning its back to Ukraine. That will not happen in Europe. And it will not happen in Europe because we are in Europe, right? So there's this kind of fundamental difference, which I think really makes, regardless of where populism lies, makes the debate in Europe today and in future, it will always be different. So no, I cannot imagine a situation in which, we're all so tired of Ukraine, so please, Putin, please serve yourself, and would you like more? Because, surely 5 regions is not enough. Go ahead, sort of, perhaps you may want Moldova as well. And once you got that, what's next? So that's not going to happen in Europe. So in Europe will become a question, not a political will. As I said, now we can, quote unquote, afford to have this. Are we tired? Are we not tired? What does public opinion think? Because the threat is, in some places, not as acute as it could be. And that is because Ukraine has been doing actually an incredibly good job, right, at keeping that Russian threat at bay. But if things were to go badly, and a situation in which levels of military support carry on this trajectory, or perhaps go down, especially if the US were to pull the plug, then things will not remain like this, right? So we are going to see Russia moving forward, and that certainly is not going to be a scenario in which, regardless of who's in power in Europe, right, it is not going to be a scenario in which Europe says, we're just, we are worried about whatever inflation, as opposed to, no, this is existential. So there's a fundamental difference there. And, I think that we can afford to have these conversations because the line is still holding. And, so that we all pray that it will continue to do so. But if it doesn't, the debate in Europe is going, it's going to turn towards a sort of reinforcement of the fundamental importance of Ukraine, because through it passes European security, not a turning away from Ukraine.
Okay, well, Natalie, let me just ask you then. Given President Macron's comments just yesterday, obviously, if the US loses interest, if Russia starts to make significant gains, I can see Europe increasing its, level of support, militarily speaking, to Ukraine in important ways. But at the end of the day, this is a territorial war, and men hold territory, and Ukraine is running out of men. They just don't have the men. So, are we really going to see, if the interests are as vital as you describe, are we going to see EU member states put troops on the ground in order to change the tide of this war if push comes to shove? Is that something where the calculus of European publics and European governments, is going to have to change over the coming months, depending on how this all plays out?
Well, I think before we get to men, we have to go to weapons. in the sense that the reason why Russia has been making the recent military advances that it made in Avdiivka, and that presumably, even in the best of circumstances, it may well continue to make over the course of this year, is because of a lack of artillery, not because of a lack of men. Then, yes, indeed, there is that sort of that there is the personnel problem, but I think it really starts with artillery. And I think the problem has been, and in a sense, it's been similar in this respect in the US and in Europe, is that we all assumed that this would be a relatively short war, right? And in a relatively short war, especially one that you're not fighting, then what you do is you kind of, provide your partner, not an ally, but a partner, you provide it with stuff that you have, yeah? So you empty your stocks. You don't change your whole sort of industrial process because you assume that the war will end. It is only now that there is, 2 years on, that there is this incredibly late moment of reckoning with the fact that, hey, this is not a short war. And because, the assumption that we had was, we're going to provide Ukraine with military support. Ukraine's going to have its counteroffensive. It may go badly, it may go well. Regardless of how it goes, it will get to a point after that counteroffensive is over in which there will be the negotiation. That's not going to happen. I mean, Putin has got no interest whatsoever in moving in this direction, right? In fact, I would add to what was said earlier that the regime in Russia now requires a permanent state of war with the West. If there's been one extremely effective sort of reframing of the internal Russian narrative, at the beginning of the war, this was a war against the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And this was about the demilitarization of Ukraine, a bit of NATO here, there, but that was part of the narrative. That didn't actually fly very well in Russia. Now, this is the great patriotic war 2.0. And that really does work in Russia. And the regime has totally reorganized on that basis. It can't afford to have a peace. So there is this kind of very late, as I said, 2 years on, awakening in Europe. And so the question then is, so how do we now prepare for that long war, which we should have started preparing 2 years before, right? But we all did, and we simply, sort of provided some old stuff that we had lying around, right? And as Russia has already been resetting itself on a war economy, which in and of itself talks of a protracted war, we're beginning to do it now. So the question then is, and this is why I think, this year is so important, because I think, if one way or another we manage to survive, or rather Ukraine manages to survive this year, then as of next year, well, things could start, because it is true. It's not as if Europeans are not doing anything, right? I mean, they are doing things. They just kind of woke up very late in doing them. I think, some of the opening of different sites in Germany for the production of ammunition. I mean, this stuff is now happening. As I said, it should have happened well before. But if then, you get to the sort of fundamental question, can Europeans make up for what may no longer come from the United States? Well, taken at face value, you would say, well, no, they can't, right? But then you kind of take a step back from all of this and you're like, okay, well, hang on a second. We have had North Korea, a kind of particularly strong, one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, that has provided Russia 3 times as much ammunition as 29, I include Norway and the United Kingdom, of the richest countries in the world, right, have done to Ukraine. So of course we can, if the threat is felt. And the threat, as I said, will be felt much more the minute in which things start going worse than what they are now.
Got it. Thanks so much. Let me come back to the question of narratives that was raised earlier and pose this question to Max, because the rallying cry for the US and Europe with respect to the war in Ukraine for the past couple of years has been a desire to defend what has come to be known as the rules-based international order. Yet Western policy towards the Israel-Hamas more recently has led to accusations of hypocrisy from the global South against Western countries. So I'm wondering if Americans and Europeans going forward are going to have to change their tune a little bit towards the Ukraine war as a result and claim that it's, as Natalie's alluding to somewhat, it's just Europe's security, in fact, that's at stake rather than the international order writ large. And might the election of Donald Trump, in fact, clear the way for that kind of a discursive change?
Well, it might. I mean, what I would say is I do think that part of a large part of the Western reaction and international reaction, as particularly of Asian countries, was seeing a larger, bigger country try to essentially swallow a smaller country and then violating what has been a post-World War II tenet of international relations of you don't do land grabs and you don't invade other countries. So I think that's an important principle. And I do think that the West can be called out for hypocrisy, and that the West should strive to not be so hypocritical is part of maybe a guiding principle of how we should think about our foreign policy a bit more carefully. But to me, I think now when we think about Ukraine now entering the third year of the war, I mean, it strikes me that the fatigue that we have, the quote unquote fatigue, I don't really see it. I look at the US polling and I think, man, this is actually polling very strongly for what is genuinely a massive foreign assistance effort, and foreign aid never polls well. I think the magic of the United States in terms of our ability to conduct foreign policy over the last really 80 years has been the Congress willing to allocate funding for administration initiatives and being very wary of actually going against the executive branch when it has a foreign policy priority. And you can argue that that may not have always been wise, but Iraq and Afghanistan was costing us 120 billion a year at one point, and there was not, there was bipartisan division within Congress, but yet the money was allocated. I think Vietnam is probably the one example that you can see Congress finally deciding it's not going to fund this anymore. And you could argue whether or not that was wise. But so what we're seeing is the collapse of a bipartisan consensus, really on the Republican Party, split within the Republican Party about whether they're willing to allocate the funding that has traditionally been allocated to advance U.S. foreign policy priorities. I do think that when we look at this from a Ukrainian perspective, that the amount that where they are right now in the war, I think feels like a very bad place where they're now losing territory, they're having to ration ammunition, and that Russia is going on the offensive. However, at this point 2 years ago, the U.S. Presumption was that Ukraine was going to have to be fighting an insurgency. And instead, what we've seen is that Ukraine is fighting conventionally and really grinding down the Russian military, one of our main adversaries. And I guess the final point I just make is that, it wasn't like during the Vietnam War. I don't imagine there was a lot of, teeth gnashing in Moscow or Beijing about, man, we really want the North Vietnamese to negotiate an end to this war because it's really costly for us. No, they were looking at it and saying, this is incredibly costly for the United States, our chief adversary. This is something we're going to support, our partner on the ground that is really taking it to them. And I think if you're just going to put a realist lens on this, I would say, man, this is great value for the money where the Russians are, you're basically depleting the Russian military. They're fully sort of occupied by this conflict. And I think it is having real internal strains on Russia and potentially Putin's grasp on power if the war doesn't go well for him. So I actually think this is of great strategic benefit to the United States to continue at very little cost. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Okay, but before, yes, go ahead, Reed.
Do you mind if I jump on that? Just because I want to agree with Max and reflect that, yes, historically, the Congress actually has parted ways with the executive branch a number of times. He noted Vietnam, adding to that, Laos and Cambodia, also Somalia and Kosovo as well, too, in terms of times when the Congress more or less halted funding to operations ongoing. But I think the narrative question is a really, really important one because I actually admire the way Max put it, that sort of realist spin on it, and probably because I hail from that intellectual camp. But I think the Biden administration could do a better job of selling that pitch to the Congress, because what I think you've had right now is sort of two uh, two positions that are almost diametrically opposed, right? That this is a war between democracy and autocracy, and the fate of the world swings in the balance of the line of demarcation in the Donbass versus the sort of adopted kind of freedom caucus position, not another dollar to Ukraine until we secure our borders, right? And what I don't think you've seen from the Biden administration, I do think it's been moving perhaps incrementally in this direction, is a more kind of sober-minded case for a supportive pipeline to Ukraine, right? A narrative that perhaps Republicans could more eagerly glom onto. And I've written at length about the way that full-throated supporters of support to Ukraine could marry interests with, I think, relatively legitimate concerns amongst those who are perhaps more skeptical of the proverbial blank check stuff. If Congress were to adopt, things like, I think there's certain measures the Congress could take that might ameliorate some of those concerns that emerge on the right? Whether that's a special inspector general or assurances that any additional supplemental aid would be offset under the terms of discretionary spending caps, or requiring essentially collective matching from Europe and our allies on the continent, or even certain mandating certifications that key stockpiles of arms and munitions and material that may be required in other important theaters are not at risk or peril. So I think there is a more sober-minded case to be made. And if I suspect at some point in time a supplemental will get through the House. It's currently cleared the Senate. I don't know and will not predict whether or not it will exist in the shape that it currently occupies. But I think ultimately it's going to be a smaller tranche. And I think certain conditions and expectations that this may be the last batch that they're going to see in Ukraine could help actually put the Ukrainians in a better position to perhaps negotiate while providing space for Europe to step up and fill those gaps as well too.
Got it. Thanks so much, Reed, and thank you to all of our audience members who have been posing their questions in the Q&A function. I am going to be getting to them in just a moment. Just a reminder to all of our audience members that the panel will be going until a quarter past the hour, so that's 12:15 Eastern time, so please do stick with us. Let me go back to Ben now and shift gears and talk a little bit more about the transatlantic security relationship. Can you help us understand, does Donald Trump, in your view, just want European countries to spend more on defense so that he can claim a political victory at home? Or does he actually want a more significant realignment in which Europe develops greater strategic autonomy, assumes more responsibility for its own defense, and that allows the US to focus more on China?
I truly don't believe that he's thought about it that deeply. So, I think it exists mostly in the rhetorical realm. I think Trump wants everyone to see that he extracted more promises and more spending from the Europeans, and that's his big priority. And even that he had trouble being focused on, let's be honest, the first time he was president. I mean, he got more pledges, although a lot of that had to do with what was already going on in Ukraine for more spending from Europeans. But it wasn't necessarily manifest in heavier spending. So I don't know really what Trump himself thinks about strategic autonomy. I would just say that it's I think a general long-time opinion in the United States foreign policy community that we want to keep Europeans as a little brother that will run along with us to our wars. But not have the capability to be entirely independent of us, which is what strategic autonomy really means. And that's been expressed in various places it sort of bubbles out because it's sort of, you're not supposed to say it out loud. And, there's real debate about that. I'm not saying it's uniform, but so, Trump might be totally fine with, non-US NATO countries developing capabilities to really organize themselves and go in a logistical sense, have wars without our help. Or he might not. I think to me, it's a bit mysterious at this time. I also, Zach, if I could just respond to a couple of things that came up real fast. I'm going to argue a little with the other panelists. One, I disagree with Natalie that Putin needs a war to stay in power. I think he was doing pretty good at that before, at least before this phase of the war in Ukraine that started 2 years ago, and even before the prior phase at staying in power. They have certainly, the Russians, adjusted to the war in a way that makes it much more kind of sustainable for them economically and politically. But I think they could also handle, Putin and his cronies could also handle peace pretty well and staying in power. I don't see a lot of prospects for them leaving anytime soon. Secondly, I agree that in the event that Russia had some giant breakthrough and really, sort of threatened Kyiv the way they did at the beginning of the war, that it would have a pretty big effect on the way Europeans think and, public opinion polling and spending on defense. And we saw that actually at the beginning of the war, and we got this big promise for spending from Germany, which never really came about, in large parts because Russia bogged down and the United States says, don't worry, we'll send 20 more thousand troops to Europe. So we sort of nipped that in the bud. But I don't think that the Russians have it in them to make that kind of big breakthrough. They can't get across to the Dnieper River, right? So, it's possible the Ukrainians could fall apart so completely that Russia could go on offense, but I still don't think that's likely. I have somewhat more confidence about this than I do predicting what's going to happen in the second Trump administration. And the reason being for that is the sort of defensive advantages we've seen in this war, where using drone-based surveillance, you can cover a lot more ground with fewer men. It's the fact that the Ukrainians still have a pretty big pool of manpower they could enlist if they wanted to. And as Zaluzny said, while he was getting himself into trouble, they could call up a few 100,000 more people, and they haven't wanted to do that for political reasons, which are understandable. But, I think there is manpower there. So I just think it's pretty unlikely that the Russians will so thoroughly defeat the Ukrainians that there's some big shift in public opinion, to me, even in Western Europe and certainly in the United States. And then finally, I wanted to say, unsurprisingly, I disagree with Max about his rendering of realist interests in Ukraine. I think the United States interests were pretty well served by what happened in the first 6 months of the war. And we could have sort of had a victory parade at that point and said, look, Russia's just got really knocked backwards. It lost a lot of men. It lost a lot of equipment. It's losing more. I disagree with people who think it's in a stronger position now than it was at the beginning of the war. I think that ignores a lot of lost capability that they're not getting back. They did organize themselves a bit better. But more importantly, or as importantly, the United States, I think, has an interest in saying if you violate the sovereignty of countries, you're going to suffer. And that interest has been well served by the events of the war, thanks to Ukraine primarily, and our money that we gave them, and all the sanctions, despite their limited effects. If we're looking to set an example that you shouldn't invade countries, I don't think anyone would see what Russia did at this point as an example to emulate, including Russia. I don't think they're going to run this experiment again anytime soon, even if you assume wrongly, in my opinion, that they'll just look at, a Baltic state or Moldova, just like they looked at Ukraine. So I think from that perspective, the United States is looking pretty good in terms of our interest in Ukraine, regardless of the movements in the line there. And so from our perspective, I think given the risks inherent in the war continuing and our support for Ukraine, we should want it to end sooner than later, regardless of the unfortunate fact that Ukraine's going to lose some territory in the offing.
Okay, a lot to unpack there, and I'm going to let anyone come in on that and share their thoughts in response if they feel the need to in their next intervention. But I just want to keep the focus on European strategic autonomy for now, if we can, and go back to you, Max, because Donald Trump is generally associated with wanting to promote American industry, American goods, for backing protectionist buy American provisions, etc. Um, is buying more American if buying, excuse me, more American military equipment is the price that Europeans have to pay to get along with Trump and preserve the American security umbrella, can there be genuine European strategic autonomy that is without a homegrown defense industry?
I mean, I guess it's possible, but I think, look, I'm deeply skeptical on a number of levels that buying American essentially buys America's heart. As someone who was at the State Department, who was part of the bureau that would go to European countries and say, please buy Patriot missile systems. We wanted countries to buy American, but if they bought French, it's not as if, our relationship with Poland was going to disintegrate. Article 5 means Article 5. Arms sales are crucially vital to U.S. foreign policy, especially in building relationships with countries. So countries like India, it's a huge part of our effort to kind of rebuild that relationship. But I'm more skeptical when it comes to Europe, and I think that when arms production doesn't lead to jobs in Europe, then I think then public support for spending a lot on defense is understandably not as strong. I mean, there's a reason why numerous defense companies spread out contracts across American states, and that for Congress, there's always strong support for defense spending, in part because it's also supporting jobs in country. And I also think there's a major dilemma. Right now, we are finding that if the U.S. got into a shooting war with China, it would run out of munitions very quickly. And let's just say Russia tried to seize on that and threaten European security. Well, guess what? And then European countries come to the U.S. and say, please supply us with more standoff weapons and other munitions. Well, the United States is going to prioritize sending its missiles to its forces first, and then when it can get to it, to Europe. So I think there's a broader dependence here that was sort of structured in the in the 90s, sort of post 9/11 world, where not facing, sort of potentially two conventional threats, one in the Pacific, one in Europe. I also just think when it comes to Trump and in his level of knowledge and understanding of European security, I totally agree with Ben. I don't think he's thought at all about European strategic autonomy. But I also think the 2% demand that Trump and also, the Obama administration, the Biden administration, lots of American administrations have been demanding more spending. I think the 2% now has become code for something that was not intended. So I think originally the folks working on Europe policy wanted European countries to contribute more to US-led NATO efforts, right? Europeans spend a bit more, and then American Supreme Allied Commander gets another brigade that the US can sort of direct for advancing European security. I think 2% now means, we think it means, or Trump now thinks it means, that means Europe can take care of itself. That is simply not the case. European defense is structured around the United States. And that, to me, is the broader problem, is that if you have an abrupt pullout of the United States, or a pull back from NATO, we're the quarterback, we're the coach of the team, we're everything. And Europeans do not have the capacity right now to simply do simple operations without the United States. And what is happening at NATO? NATO is not telling them to, you need to dramatically buy air tankers, air enablers, all intel, all the things that are crucial to conducting operations to sort of augment the U.S. in case we're running off to the Pacific or just not there. And that is where I'm very confused about what is happening over the last 2 years in the wake of this war.
Reed, can I come back to you on this question? And Max just dwelled on this theme just now. It seems that U.S. administrations consistently want Europeans to spend more on defense, but only in a way that preserves the institutions and structures of U.S. primacy and leadership in Europe. So is that going to change in a second Trump administration? Are we going to see that cycle broken? Are we going to see significant threats on the part of Trump lead to major change in how Europeans prepare for their own defense. Kind of like we saw in his first term, in which, we saw, significant increases in European defense spending, in part because there really was this sense that this guy's unpredictable, so we have to take him at his word.
Yeah, the way I'd reply to that question is not by citing anything that Donald Trump has necessarily said recently, but I'd look to some of the people that are in his inner circle that are probably more serious and have thought more intentionally about the future of transatlantic relations and America's obligations to the NATO alliance. So obviously there was a lot of Sturm and Drang surrounding Trump's recent comments about, Putin should go ahead and do whatever he wants to states that aren't meeting their spending obligations. I think probably what flew under the radar were comments from folks like Keith Kellogg, his former national security advisor to Vice President Pence and chief of staff for the NSA, who proposed something resembling essentially a two-tiered system of NATO, where states that didn't meet their 2% spend would no longer enjoy Article 5 protections from the United States. Or Robert O'Brien, Trump's former NSA, and probably a likely addition to a second Trump administration, who talked about leveling tariffs on states that didn't, special tariffs on states that didn't meet their 2% spend obligations. These are people that I think are probably more serious about some of these matters, literally by dint of their employment and experience. And I don't know if this is them necessarily politicking, for their as they begin to measure the drapes for their future office in the executive office building or the White House, or if this is actually kind of what they're communicating to the former president. I presume a little bit of both. I think you also look at some people who are probably even more radical in terms of their willingness to disrupt orthodoxies vis-a-vis NATO. Some of the folks, without getting into any names, right, who are probably on the short list for a Trump chief of staff position, I think would be very willing to walk the U.S. out of NATO abruptly. So I think it's going to run the gamut. I definitely think status quo is unlikely based on what one hears from the people that would undoubtedly surround President Trump in a second administration. So I think we would be looking at some changes beyond serving Chancellor Merkel and an invoice for services rendered sorts of stuff that was unpleasant, undiplomatic, undoubtedly alarming. I think you might actually see some substantive changes in America's disposition towards the alliance. Is that helpful?
That's great. Thank you so much. Let me come back to Natalie now, and let's imagine that Trump's elected and we end up with some kind of deal that the US and Ukraine and Russia can all live with, that gives Ukraine some kind of security guarantees and allows it to rebuild, and some kind of confidence building measures, disengagement zone, let's say, that gives Ukraine reassurances that Russia's not going to attack again. Russia's security concerns are addressed in some fashion as well. Let's say that happens. Given how differently the 27 members of the EU view their national interests, would any kind of deal like that over Ukraine's future fragment the EU's common foreign and security policy and hobble efforts to strengthen European strategic autonomy in important ways? Put differently, how much does the EU's actorness and unity depend on a lowest common denominator approach, and in some ways even the avoidance of strategic decision making? And perhaps just to be a little bit provocative, you mentioned that Putin needs this war to continue. Does the EU need this war to continue in order to maintain its unity, which is relatively thin and perhaps only on a few key issues?
No, I'm going to say it's difficult to imagine that situation, right? I mean, I really cannot, I cannot see the dynamics that would lead to that kind of agreement. I definitely see, I could imagine a story, and the story goes a little bit as follows. Sort of Trump returns to the White House, calls his friend Vova, and proposes to Putin the deal. And the deal is basically, hey, what would you like? Would you like to keep, the territory that you have? And Putin says, well, actually, I'd like a little bit more. Okay, what's more? And, whatever it is. And Trump agrees to it and basically says to Zelensky, given that he wants Zelensky out anyway, sort of the deal is you're out. We have a nice pro-Russian leader in Kyiv. Russia takes this amount of territory, and that's the deal. Now, the question is, how does that play out? So presumably that plays out in a manner in which Ukraine would not stop fighting, right? It would start losing even more, because that is basically the scenario that we've been talking about. But there is not some sort of alternative leadership out there in Ukraine that would accept that kind of deal. Yeah, so Ukraine would keep on fighting. So then the question is, will Europeans keep on supporting Ukraine? And this is where I come to my answer, at the very beginning of this conversation. I can't picture a scenario in which Europeans would pull out. I think, the divisions that you're referring to are far more likely to emerge in a situation in which Ukraine's doing well rather than a situation in which Ukraine's doing badly. And I can't see a scenario in which the deal is one which actually leads to a stabilization, basically, of Europe. So, but going back, sort of to pick up this thread about divisions in Europe, how is it that I can see those playing out in a Trump scenario? When Trump first came to office, there was this rather sort of unseemly show of Europeans, running over to Washington to kiss the ring, right? And there was a bit of, there was a real competition basically there going on. So I can definitely imagine that happening. And so divisions happening as a consequence of that. And that can be, again, a consequence of different kind of calculations. There could be some countries in Eastern Europe that, much as they dislike Trump, for the reasons that Max was mentioning earlier, just know that they cannot do without the United States. And so they would just kind of hold their noses and just run over to Washington. Then you have different kind of governments. Yeah, take my own. Here we have a prime minister that has been behaving as a good Western citizen and behaving as a good European citizen. That is because Joe Biden is sitting in the White House. Trust you me, the minute in which there is someone else and someone like Donald Trump, I don't think that it would be, the same kind of tune that we've been hearing over the last year and a half. So you can imagine tensions there between Italy on the one hand and France, Germany, and Spain, for instance, on the other, right? So I can imagine those divisions playing out under a Trump scenario. Mind you, I can always also imagine the reverse, yeah? I can also imagine actually Trump having a coalescing effect on Europe. In a way, actually, this happened also last time round. So you can imagine both these sets of things coexisting at the same time, right? When Trump was first in office, the whole strategic autonomy debate that you were mentioning earlier, that happened back then. Now, let alone the fact that it didn't happen, and perhaps it cannot happen, but that's in a sense a different conversation, yeah? But it did have this sort of unifying, sort of galvanizing effect on Europe, as in, Europe and, sort of Chancellor Merkel, leader of the free world, given that the real, the other leader was basically sort of, had left the scene. So there was this sense of kind of rediscovering a European identity as a consequence of Trump, given that identities normally are actually sort of, constructed in opposition to something else. So, there isn't an alternative world out there in which, there is Europe, in a sense, facing three dictators, one in Washington, one in Beijing, and one in Moscow, and that having a galvanizing and unifying effect on Europe. But then you could also have that, sort of lowest common denominator divisions playing out. And in fact, in a sense, although this is hard to conceive, you can actually have and probably would have both of these things happening at the same time.
Can I just ask you on that last point that you just raised? You mentioned the sort of three dictators out there, and this could galvanize or consolidate some kind of European identity. But given that Donald Trump doesn't exactly hold liberal values or the notion of an international order based on common rules in the highest regard, how would Europe be able to continue depending on the US for its security under Trump while simultaneously claiming to be committed to a liberal order or a rules-based order? I mean, this would have to be a major blow for Europe's self-image and for its image in the world, would it not?
Well, it was like this last time round, though. And yet it happened, right? I mean, I don't think that the image that Trump would give as a person, right, would be any more or less liberal or illiberal compared to what he was last time round. So in a sense, it is precisely because, in a sense, the leader of that liberal international order would, from which, as we know, Europe has benefited so much, would be missing. That in and of itself would basically force Europeans to step up. And in a sense, as I said, this is what they tried to do last time round as well. Both in terms of that defense conversation, although of course this was happening still in a time of relative peace, right? Whereas now our continent is at war, so it would be a different story, and it would be a far more quote unquote serious story. Perhaps not sufficiently serious, but it definitely would be a serious story. But then more broadly, as far as the whole debate on rules and multilateralism, then definitely you would see Europeans trying to step up and do more. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that they would be effective in doing so. I mean, I personally think that largely as a consequence of what's happening in the Middle East, actually, we're in a far more complicated spot now than we were, a few years back. So I'm not saying it's easy or that we would succeed, but I'm absolutely sure that this is exactly what we'll be trying to do.
Gotcha. I've got a couple of audience questions that I'd like to get to now, and I'm going to pose them to all of you and just go around the horn, starting with Max. Number one is, what's the objective here? What is the actual objective as it relates to Ukraine? We can talk about supporting Ukraine militarily, quote unquote, for as long as it takes, but as long as it takes to do what? To accomplish what specifically? We heard on the eve of the counteroffensive that the idea is to make some gains to put Ukraine in a better position at the negotiating table, but again, to negotiate what? So what's the ultimate objective? And can we imagine the US and Europe, with all of the different national interests that are at stake there, actually agreeing on a common strategic objective in Ukraine? And then we've got a question from Yannick Scheidegger as well. It was mentioned in this discussion that Russia needs, war with the West. So the question is, can we prepare for this war? Is Russia actually willing to start a war with NATO, and based on what assumptions? Is that something that we absolutely need to start getting serious about? And if so, let me say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, given that it marks the final collapse of the cooperative security order in Europe, which was marked by arms control, transparency measures, and a set of common behavioral norms. Now we're entering this new Cold War in which we're preparing potentially for war with Russia, and security is not going to cost 2% of GDP. During the Cold War, security cost 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6% of GDP. So how are we going to justify spending that much on defense for a years-long, possibly even decades-long standoff with Russia, instead of devoting those resources to fighting the climate crisis, and the economic dislocation, of course, service-wise, that is going to be necessary to support populations who are dislocated as a result of fighting the climate crisis, and adapting to the climate crisis. So a lot to unpack there, but two basic core questions. Max, can you weigh in on any of the above?
Yeah. What are our objectives in Ukraine? I think the first objective is to ensure Ukraine's survival. And I think in some ways we've achieved that. I agree with Ben that I think that Russia's offensive combat capacity has been severely curtailed, given the strength of the Ukrainian pushback and how much Ukraine has attrited the Russians. However, it's not gone. Russian defense industry is ramping up and Russia may mobilize. So I think Ukraine's survival is still not assured. So I think that's number one. Number two, the way I would describe it is our goals are that Ukraine can end the war on terms that it finds acceptable. Now, I don't know if that means that Ukraine needs to take back all the territory that it had pre-2014. It may be that a negotiated settlement is the way that Ukraine wants to go. But in order to get there, I would say that Ukraine has to be strong enough in order for the Russians to want to have negotiations. I think that could be possible, but I think we're at a point right now where the Russians need to, I think they're going to win, and we need to reverse that calculus to the point where Russians fear that they could lose. And that Ukraine also looks at the calculus and says, you know what, it's not worth us, potentially losing another 100,000 people in this war. And that's generally how negotiated settlements of a conflict end. But I would say that that's firmly in our interests. And I would say maybe number three, to just continue to deplete the Russian forces to the point where we're continuing to erode the Kremlin's ability to act as in a negative way around the world. Now that's not solved by the battlefield, but that has contributed to that. And maybe just say that the war with Russia and that whether we have to be concerned about that, I think we do have to be concerned about that. I don't necessarily think we need to be panicked about it. And I do think that one of the concerns that I have of a Trump 2.0 and potential pull out of NATO or pull back from NATO is this, what I mentioned earlier, is Europe's ability to step up and step in for the gap left by the United States, I think is not necessarily assured. And I would hope that there would be more joint collective European action. I've highlighted the role of the EU potentially playing in fostering greater European defense integration, which I think is critical. But I do think that if there's a security vacuum created in Europe, and the United States is seen as sort of essentially removing its nuclear deterrent, I would be very concerned about the potential impact of a NATO-Russia war. And maybe that doesn't involve the United States, but I think it would be potentially incredibly deadly and impactful to the world.
Okay, thanks so much. Ben, your sense on all of this and supporting Ukraine, until they can get to a position that, they basically like. Are there not inherent escalation risks with that, with a war happening in the heart of Europe, possibly for many years, if that's what it takes to get to a position where the Ukrainians are, satisfied with the outcome?
There are inherent escalation risks, but my position has been that I wrote a paper about this in the summer, that the United States should feature or aim for what we called armed neutrality for Ukraine, which is to say, we're not going to put them in NATO or give them any other kind of security guarantee. I think that's for various reasons sort of the worst thing we could do. But we'll continue to arm them primarily for a defensive style war, which they are already shifting towards. Emma Ashford and Kelly Grieco wrote a good piece about this in Foreign Affairs, shifting what a sort of defensive strategy would mean. So I think, we should do that. It would cost, I don't know exactly what it would cost, but it costs substantially less than the bill that Congress is looking at now. If you're serious about, saying, sorry guys, we don't think you really can go on offense anymore in a meaningful way. So what we think you should do is grind down the Russians, fortify, maybe call up some more manpower, and I think continuing to do that while pursuing potentially an armistice, at least, if not sort of a full-on settlement, would be the way I would go. A couple other points. I would say, one, I disagree with the premise you, I think, included there, Zach, that if we're having another Cold War with Russia, we need to go to 5% of spending on defense, or European countries do. I think, obviously, it sort of depends what you mean by a new Cold War, but we're a lot richer than we used to be. So for the United States now, for whatever, 3.5% of GDP gets what we used to get in real terms, say in the Truman administration, Korean War, for when we spent 13% of GDP. Like, we spend now and more in real terms than we did then. So getting rich, which the Western Europeans have done too, allows you to spend substantially less and make less effort and produce more military goods. Third, I wanted to raise the point that came up before, if I could, that to me, strategic autonomy takes two things, at least one of them and probably both of them. One is a U.S. that at least partially withdraws troops, if not political support, from Europe, and two, a big Russian threat that's scary. And so I think the first Trump administration people thought, oh, maybe we're entering that world, but we weren't. The Trump wasn't that serious about it, and the Russian threat prior to this invasion didn't seem that big. So therefore, in my opinion, there wasn't that much movement. The question now is, would we potentially move towards those two factors obtaining? I still think not on both ends. So therefore, I don't think there's going to be a lot of movement towards strategic autonomy. But I would still note that even in the event that the United States does, actually exits NATO, or what is more likely, in my opinion, and more desirable, in my opinion, does a kind of what I would call an Irish goodbye of just kind of, making no formal changes, but removing troops, then I'm not sure that even would be enough given the limits of the Russian threat.
Okay, Natalie, over to you, because I know you have to leave, and then Reed, over to you.
Just very briefly, let me just say, sort of, I'm with Max. What is, what is peace, right, or what is victory? Well, it is a sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine that I think at this point in time eventually will need and probably will enter the European Union in some shape or form. Whether that sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine is the product of a negotiation with Russia, or whether it's the product of a Ukraine that will continue to be in a sense, state of non-peace, in a sense, at the very least, with Russia. I actually think that's a far more likely scenario. But si vis pace para bellum, if you want peace, you have to prepare for war. And basically, in a sense, whether that outcome is a negotiated one or a non-negotiated one, in a sense, what you have to do to achieve it is exactly the same thing, right? And I think the same holds for the rest of Europe. So do I think Russia is about to attack NATO? No, it's not going to attack NATO tomorrow morning. Well, if nothing is done, then yes, it might. So again, it's not going to happen to the extent that something is done in order for it not to happen. And that something is indeed, in a sense, really stepping up on defense. Will this take more money? Yes, obviously it will take more money. I agree with Ben. If we basically have, mind you, you do have several by now European countries that spend way more than 2% on defense, which also makes this whole Trump point a rather odd one, right? Because in a sense, Putin's not going to invade Italy, right? It's not going to invade Spain. It would be, in a sense, stretching the countries that are now spending 2, 3, 4% GDP on defense. So I'm not quite sure, sort of how that will play out. Either way, it is clear that if, on average, all European countries spent 2% and actually started making a better job at spending that money together, of course, we are rich countries. Of course, we would by far outmatch what Russia would be able to do. The point is that we're not really on that trajectory yet.
Excellent. Thanks so much for being with us, Natalie, and thank you for sharing your wisdom in Latin from Rome as well. Only appropriate. Grateful to have you. Grazie. Alla prossima. Reed, over to you. Last word.
Yeah, just thinking about your proposition, perhaps I agree kind of with what's been said, right? From America's perspective, I think Ben put this out pretty nicely, right? Our interests have largely been served. Ukraine's sovereignty that was so acutely under threat in the opening days of the war is mostly assured. Russia's been punished severely for its war of aggression. Europe is beginning to step up in a way that it's important. I would sort of stretch the parameters, perhaps, of, what can perhaps be achieved in furtherance of, our party's interests. And I think that a Ukraine that is, free, sovereign, market liberal, and democratic, not perhaps in the year 2025, but imagine Ukraine in the year 2045, right? Think about perhaps the, divergent paths of North and South Korea after the Korean War concluded in armistice. Like, I propose that there would be no doubt about who emerged triumphant from this war in 20 years' time if Ukraine is able to maximize the benefits of peace and sovereignty democratic order and a market liberal orientation towards the European continent. And whether or not the line of demarcation is 10 miles east or west today would have very little bearing, I think, on that perhaps rosier picture for Ukraine's future in some tense down the road. So I would just imagine a happier ending, perhaps, and one which would also perhaps include a Europe that stands up for itself, not because of Donald Trump, right, but because it is a wealthy, capable, and populous continent. I don't think ultimately hinging the question or matter of European autonomy on Donald Trump is necessarily healthy. I think for Europe to be sovereign and autonomous and more federal, I think is ultimately a matter of European advantage.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Reed. And on that note, allow me to thank all four of our panelists today, Ben Friedman, Reed Smith, Nathalie Tocci, and Max Bergman. Grateful for you all for joining us at IPD today. Hope we'll be able to host you again. We've unpacked a lot and covered a lot of ground, and we'll continue to do so over the months ahead. Thanks to our audience for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon.
All right. Thanks, man.